The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, Mountain Standard Time. In the depths of Nelly's Air Force Base's command bunker, a transmission pierced the pre-dawn darkness that would haunt every soul who heard it. Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper 77 declaring emergency. Aircraft severely damaged, multiple systems failures, requesting immediate emergency landing. The voice was steady, professional, impossibly calm given what satellite imagery was showing on the main display screen. General Marcus Thornfield stood frozen before the massive tactical overview monitor, his weathered hands gripping the metal railing until his knuckles went white. The infrared feed from an orbiting Predator drone painted a horrifying picture across the Nevada desert. What had once been a pristine A-10 Thunderbolt II was now a flying catastrophe, trailing flames and debris across 20 miles of barren landscape. The aircraft's right engine was completely gone, torn away by what appeared to be a direct hit from surface-to-air missile fragments. The left wing showed massive structural damage, with jagged holes punched through the titanium armor plating that surrounded the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid streamed behind the aircraft like arterial blood, and yet somehow, impossibly, it continued flying. "Sir," whispered Major Rodriguez, the duty officer whose voice betrayed 3 decades of military composure cracking at the edges. "The pilot survived the Kandahar corridor." The Kandahar corridor. Even speaking those words in the sterile environment of the command center felt like invoking a curse. It was a 15-mile stretch of Afghan mountain valley that had claimed 17 coalition aircraft in the past 8 months. The Taliban had turned it into a killing field, a gauntlet of overlapping anti-aircraft batteries, shoulder-fired missiles, and concentrated small arms fire that could shred even the most heavily armored aircraft. Every military strategist, every tactical analysis, every computer simulation had reached the same inevitable conclusion. No single aircraft could survive a solo run through that valley. The mathematics of warfare were absolute. The defensive positions were too numerous, too well coordinated, too perfectly positioned. It was a suicide mission disguised as a tactical operation. "Impossible," Thornfield muttered, but his eyes remained locked on the infrared signature of the damaged A-10 as it limped across the desert, defying every law of aerodynamics and military probability. "Rodriguez, get me the pilot's file. Now." As the major's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up classified personnel records, the radio crackled again. "Tower, this is Viper 77. I'm going to need the longest runway you've got, and tell the crash teams to stand by. This bird's held together with prayer and stubbornness, but I'm bringing her home." There was something in that voice, something that made every person in the command center lean forward, straining to hear every word. It wasn't just confidence. It was something deeper, something forged in fire and tested beyond human endurance. The morning sun began to creep over the Nevada mountains, casting long shadows across the airfield where emergency vehicles were already positioning themselves along runway 3 left. In the distance, a small black speck appeared against the orange horizon, trailing smoke and fire, carrying with it a story that would reshape everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the thin line between heroism and madness. The speck grew larger, and with it, the mystery deepened. What had happened in the Kandahar corridor? How had one pilot accomplished what entire squadrons had failed to achieve? And why did General Thornfield's face drain of all color as he stared at the personnel file, now glowing on Major Rodriguez's screen? The answers were approaching at 200 miles per hour, wrapped in twisted metal and trailing flames across the brightening sky. But first, they would have to survive the landing. In the control tower, Air Traffic Controller Sarah Chen watched her radar screen with growing concern. The aircraft's approach was erratic, losing altitude faster than recommended, the pilot fighting against damaged flight controls that threatened to send the A-10 into an unrecoverable spiral with each passing second. "Viper 77, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding before her eyes. "You're cleared for emergency landing, runway 3 left. Emergency vehicles are standing by and the runway is yours." She paused, watching the blip on her screen wobble dangerously. "Pilot, what's your fuel status?" The response came back immediately, tinged with what might have been dark humor. "Tower, I've got about 15 minutes of fuel and 30 minutes of problems. But don't worry, I've been in worse situations than this." There was a brief pause, filled only with static and the distant whine of a damaged turbofan engine. "Besides, I made a promise to some people back in Kandahar. I intend to keep it." In the command bunker below, General Thornfield was speed-reading through a classified personnel file that made his blood run cold. The pilot of Viper 77 wasn't just any aviator. She was Captain Luna Wraith Castellanos, and her call sign wasn't earned through some trivial flight school incident or barracks room joke. She had earned it the hard way, in the unforgiving skies above Afghanistan, where she had developed an almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar, to strike targets that were supposed to be impossible to reach, and to return from missions that should have been one-way trips. Her record was a catalog of impossible achievements wrapped in official language and classified mission reports. 17 confirmed kills of high-value targets, 43 successful close air support missions in contested airspace, 0 casualties among the ground forces she had supported, 0 mission failures. But there was something else in her file, something that made Thornfield's hands shake as he read it. A psychological evaluation from 6 months ago that had recommended she be pulled from active combat duty. The Air Force psychiatrist had noted signs of survivor's guilt, possible PTSD, and an increasingly reckless disregard for personal safety in combat situations. The recommendation had been overruled by her commanding officer, who had written in the margin, "Captain Castellanos is the finest combat pilot I have ever served with. Removing her from active duty would be tantamount to disarming our most effective weapon against enemy forces. Recommendation denied." Now, as Thornfield watched the damaged A-10 approach the runway, he wondered if that decision had been the right one. The Kandahar corridor mission had been classified at the highest levels, authorized only after every other option had been exhausted. Intelligence reports had indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, was meeting with foreign weapons suppliers in a compound deep within the valley. The window of opportunity would be narrow, perhaps only minutes, and the defensive gauntlet protecting the target was absolute. Every computer simulation had shown the same result. Any aircraft attempting the mission would be shot down within the first 2 miles of the valley. The mathematics were unforgiving. Surface-to-air missile sites covered every possible approach angle. The valley walls channeled aircraft into predetermined kill zones where concentrated fire could overwhelm even the A-10's legendary durability. It was, by every measure of military analysis, an impossible mission. But Captain Castellanos had volunteered anyway. More than volunteered, she had insisted. During the mission briefing, she had stood before a room full of senior officers and laid out a flight plan that seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. She would approach the valley at terrain following altitude, using the mountain ridges to mask her approach. She would ingress at maximum speed, acquire the target, deliver her ordnance, and egress before the enemy could coordinate an effective response. "It's a suicide mission," Colonel Williams had said bluntly. "The odds of survival are essentially 0. Castellanos had looked him directly in the eye and replied, "Sir, with respect, I don't fly by the odds, I fly by results, and I've never failed to complete a mission." Her voice had carried a quiet intensity that silenced every objection. "Those soldiers on the ground are counting on us. I won't let them down." The mission had been authorized with extreme reluctance. Everyone in the room knew they were potentially sending one of their best pilots to her death. But they also knew that without eliminating the high-value target, coalition forces would continue to face coordinated attacks that could cost dozens of lives. As the sun climbed higher over Nellie's Air Force Base, Emergency vehicles lined runway 3 left like automotive sentinels, their red and blue lights painting the tarmac in urgent colors. The damaged A-10 was now visible to the naked eye, a dark silhouette against the morning sky that seemed to shimmer with heat distortion and trailing smoke. From the control tower, observers could see the extent of the damage. The right engine nacelle was completely gone, the left wing showed multiple puncture wounds, and the aircraft's approach was anything but stable. "Jesus," whispered one of the tower controllers, "how is that thing still flying?" Air traffic controller Chen adjusted her headset and keyed her microphone. "Viper 77, I'm showing you approximately 2 miles out. How are your flight controls?" The response crackled through speakers filled with interference and the background noise of damaged aircraft systems. "Tower, I've got about 40% control authority, maybe less. She's fighting me on every input, but we're going to make this work. I need you to clear the runway and tell the crash teams to stay back until I'm completely stopped. This landing might get interesting." In the command bunker, General Thornfield was piecing together fragments of intelligence reports that painted a picture of what had transpired in the Kandahar corridor. Initial radio intercepts suggested that Captain Castellanos had successfully penetrated the valley's defenses, but the details were fragmentary and confusing. Taliban communications indicated massive surprise and confusion as the A-10 had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, struck its target with precision-guided munitions, and then vanished again before coordinated defensive fire could be brought to bear. But something had gone wrong during the egress. Satellite imagery showed missile contrails and explosion signatures throughout the valley as enemy forces had desperately tried to bring down the escaping aircraft. Multiple hits were confirmed, impacts that should have been fatal to any aircraft and any pilot. Yet somehow, Captain Castellanos had fought her way clear of the valley and begun the long journey home across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. "Sir," Major Rodriguez said quietly, "we're getting reports from ground controllers along her flight path. She's been flying for over 3 hours on damaged systems, maintaining radio contact with coalition forces and providing situation reports. But sir," he paused, consulting his notes, "her radio transmissions have been increasingly erratic. The stress of flying a damaged aircraft for this long, combined with possible injuries. We need to be prepared for the possibility that she might not be able to execute a controlled landing." Thornfield nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the approaching aircraft. Through the overhead speakers, they could hear radio chatter from the emergency response teams as they positioned themselves for what could become a catastrophic crash landing. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles spread out along the runway approach, their crews performing final equipment checks and preparing for the worst-case scenario. The A-10 was now less than a mile out, and the full extent of its damage was becoming horrifyingly clear. The right engine was completely absent, leaving a gaping wound in the aircraft's fuselage. The left wing's leading edge was shredded, with multiple puncture holes and what appeared to be unexploded ordnance fragments embedded in the structure. Hydraulic fluid continued to stream from ruptured lines, creating a visible trail through the air. Most disturbing of all, the cockpit canopy showed spiderweb cracks and what might have been bullet holes. "How is she even conscious?" someone whispered in the command center. The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Through the radio came Captain Castellanos' voice, steady despite the circumstances. "Tower, Viper 77 is on final approach. I'm committing to this landing, no go-around capability. If this goes sideways, tell my squadron they flew with the best, and tell those boys in Kandahar that the target is neutralized. Mission accomplished." There was something in those words, a finality that suggested she was preparing for more than just a difficult landing. In the control tower, Sarah Chen felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes as she keyed her microphone for what might be the final transmission. "Viper 77, you're cleared to land. Bring her home, pilot, bring her home." The damaged A-10 Thunderbolt II crossed the runway threshold at an approach angle that made every aviation expert watching hold their breath. Captain Castellanos was fighting against flight controls that responded to her inputs like a wild animal, fighting every correction and threatening to send the aircraft into an unrecoverable situation with each passing second. The left main landing gear deployed with visible difficulty, the hydraulic systems barely providing enough pressure to lower and lock the wheels. The right gear remained retracted, whether by design or system failure, no one could tell from the ground. Gear problem, Viper 77, called the tower controller. Your right main gear is showing unsafe. Copy tower, I know. Castellanos' voice came through the radio with an odd calmness that seemed almost supernatural given the circumstances. Flying on one main gear and a prayer. Tell the crash crews to stand by for a hot landing. The A-10 touched down hard on the left main gear, the aircraft immediately tilting to the right as the damaged wing scraped against the concrete runway in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though the aircraft would flip over or veer off the runway entirely. But somehow, Captain Castellanos maintained control, using differential braking and what little rudder authority she had left to keep the aircraft tracking down the center line. The screech of metal against concrete filled the morning air as the A-10 slid down the runway, shedding pieces of wing and fuselage like a wounded animal leaving a blood trail. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the sliding aircraft, their crews ready to respond the instant it came to a stop. Fire suppression foam began spraying automatically as damaged fuel lines leaked aviation fuel across the hot concrete. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 30 seconds, the A-10 finally came to rest approximately 4,000 feet down the runway, surrounded by a cloud of steam, smoke, and foam. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ticking of hot metal and the distant whine of emergency sirens. Then the cockpit canopy began to move, opening with mechanical difficulty as damaged actuators struggled to function. Captain Luna Castellanos emerged from the cockpit under her own power, though she moved with obvious pain and stiffness. She was smaller than anyone had expected, perhaps 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that was now disheveled from hours under a flight helmet. Her flight suit was stained with what appeared to be blood and hydraulic fluid, and there were visible cuts on her hands and face. But her eyes burned with an intensity that made every observer understand immediately that they were looking at someone extraordinary. She stood on the wing of her destroyed aircraft for a moment, surveying the damage that should have killed her hours ago. Then she began the careful climb down to the runway, waving off the medical personnel who rushed forward to assist her. Her first words, caught by the sensitive microphones of the emergency response team, would later become legendary within the Air Force community. Tell maintenance they can write this bird up as slightly used. And someone get me a phone. I need to call Kandahar and confirm the target is down. As she walked away from the smoking wreckage of Viper 77, leaving behind twisted metal and a story that would be told and retold for decades to come, Captain Luna Castellanos appeared to be nothing more than a small, injured pilot who had somehow survived an impossible mission. But those who witnessed her emergence from that burning aircraft knew they had seen something that transcended ordinary human experience, a display of skill, courage, and sheer determination that redefined what was possible in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat. The medical evaluation would later reveal the full extent of what she had endured: 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, multiple lacerations from cockpit debris, and severe dehydration from flying for over 3 hours in a damaged aircraft with a compromised environmental control system. The fact that she had maintained consciousness, let alone control of her aircraft, throughout the entire ordeal was medically improbable. But the physical injuries were only part of the story. As General Thornfield watched the small figure walking across the tarmac, surrounded by medical personnel and debriefing officers, he realized that Captain Luna Castellanos had accomplished something that would reshape military aviation doctrine. She had proven that the impossible was merely improbable, that human determination could overcome mathematical certainty, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerged from the most impossible circumstances. In the hours that followed, as intelligence analysts pored over mission data and reconnaissance imagery, confirmed the successful elimination of the high-value target, a different picture began to emerge of what had transpired in the Kandahar corridor. Captain Castellanos hadn't simply survived the mission. She had redefined it, turning what should have been a suicide run into a masterclass in precision flying and tactical innovation. The morning sun climbed higher over Nellie's Air Force Base, casting long shadows across the runway, where the twisted remains of Viper 77 would stand as a monument to the thin line between courage and madness, between impossible odds and extraordinary achievement. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of what would later be called the Kandahar miracle, there were only questions without answers, and the lingering smoke from an aircraft that had defied every law of probability to bring its pilot home. The debriefing began immediately in a secure conference room deep within the base's intelligence facility. Captain Castellanos sat at a metal table, still wearing her stained flight suit, a cup of black coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared at the wall-mounted displays showing satellite imagery of the Kandahar corridor. Her eyes traced the route she had flown hours earlier, each landmark and terrain feature triggering memories of a mission that had pushed her beyond the limits of human endurance. General Thornfield entered the room with his aide and the base intelligence officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, a sharp-eyed woman whose reputation for extracting truth from incomplete information was legendary throughout the Air Force. The general took a seat across from Castellanos, studying her face for signs of the psychological trauma that should have accompanied such an experience. What he saw instead was a pilot still completely focused on the mission, her mind sharp despite her physical injuries. "Captain," he began, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "I need to understand what happened out there. According to every analysis we conducted, no single aircraft could penetrate the Kandahar corridor and survive. Yet here you are, and our intelligence confirms the target was eliminated with surgical precision. How did you do it?" Castellanos looked up from her coffee, meeting the general's gaze directly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the bravado or false heroics that might have been expected. Instead, it was quiet, professional, and tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Sir, I didn't do anything that any other pilot wouldn't have done in the same situation. I had good intelligence, a solid aircraft, and a clear mission objective. The rest was just flying." She paused, taking a small sip of her coffee. The Taliban weren't expecting a single aircraft to attempt ingress during daylight hours. Their defensive positions were oriented toward traditional multi-aircraft strikes approaching from predictable vectors. I took advantage of their assumptions. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Captain, our satellite imagery shows at least 17 separate missile launches within the valley during your ingress and egress. Multiple impacts are confirmed on your aircraft. By all accounts, you should have been shot down within the first 3 minutes of the engagement. What am I missing?" For the first time since entering the room, Castellanos smiled, a small, weary expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, the A-10 is a remarkable aircraft. It's designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. But more than that, it's designed to get close to the ground, to use terrain masking and unpredictable flight paths to avoid enemy fire. I flew it the way it was meant to be flown, low, fast, and angry." She stood up slowly, moving to the large tactical display that showed a detailed topographical map of the Kandahar corridor. Her finger traced a route that seemed to defy logic, weaving between known missile sites and anti-aircraft positions with precision that suggested either extraordinary luck or supernatural skill. "I entered the valley here," she said, pointing to a narrow gap between two mountain peaks, flying at about 50 feet above ground level, using this ridgeline to mask my approach from the primary SAM sites. The Taliban had concentrated their defenses around the three most obvious ingress routes. They weren't expecting someone to thread the needle between established kill zones. General Thornfield studied the route she had indicated, his expression growing more incredulous with each detail. "Captain, that approach requires flying through a box canyon with less than 200 feet of clearance on either side. At the speed you would need to maintain to avoid defensive fire, the margin for error would be essentially zero. One miscalculation, one wind gust, and you would have flown directly into solid rock." "Yes, sir." Her response was simple, matter-of-fact, as though discussing routine flight procedures rather than a maneuver that bordered on insanity. But it was the only approach that gave me a reasonable chance of reaching the target without being detected until the last possible moment. Colonel Hayes continued taking notes, but her expression suggested she was recording something that defied conventional understanding. "And once you reached the target area." Castellanos returned to her seat, her movements betraying the pain from her injuries but her voice remaining steady. "The target compound was exactly where intelligence said it would be. I had visual contact with the high-value individual approximately 30 seconds before weapon release. Time on target was minimal, maybe 45 seconds total. I delivered two AGM-65 Mavericks and confirmed secondary explosions indicating successful target destruction." "And then," pressed the general, "and then all hell broke loose." For the first time, her professional composure cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the human being behind the pilot's mask. "The Taliban had been caught off guard by my ingress, but they recovered quickly. By the time I was beginning my egress, every anti-aircraft weapon in the valley was tracking me. I took multiple hits during the first 2 miles of the escape route." She gestured toward the tactical display again, her finger tracing a chaotic pattern that suggested desperate improvisation rather than planned tactics. "I lost my right engine about here, maybe 3 miles from the target. The aircraft became significantly more difficult to control, and I was losing altitude faster than I wanted. But the A-10 kept flying, kept responding to my inputs even with multiple system failures." General Thornfield leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "Captain, our damage assessment team has had a preliminary look at your aircraft. You took 17 separate impacts from various weapon systems. The right engine was completely destroyed. The hydraulic system was compromised in multiple locations. You had structural damage to both wings, and your environmental control system was failed. How did you maintain consciousness, let alone control of the aircraft, for over 3 hours?" The question hung in the air between them, encompassing not just the technical impossibility of what she had accomplished, but the human impossibility as well. Castellanos was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands as though seeing them for the first time. "Sir, I'm not sure I can give you an answer that makes sense from a technical standpoint. After the first few hits, the aircraft should have been unflyable. The control inputs I was making shouldn't have been sufficient to maintain level flight, let alone navigate back to base. But—" she paused, searching for words to describe something that existed beyond the realm of standard pilot training. "But the aircraft responded anyway. Not normally, not the way it should have according to the technical manuals, but it responded. It was like flying a wounded animal that still had fight left in it. Every input was a negotiation. Every course correction was a compromise between what I needed the aircraft to do and what it was still capable of doing." Colonel Hayes looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. "Captain, in your psychological evaluation 6 months ago, there were notations about your relationship with your aircraft. The evaluating psychologist noted what he termed an unusual degree of anthropomorphization, essentially, that you talked about military aircraft as though they were living entities rather than machines. Is that accurate?" Castellanos met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, every pilot develops a relationship with their aircraft. It's impossible to spend hundreds of hours in a cockpit without beginning to understand the personality of the machine you're flying. Some aircraft are forgiving, some are temperamental, some are eager to please. The A-10. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The A-10 has personality. It's tough, stubborn, willing to take punishment and keep fighting. Flying one is like partnering with something that shares your mission, your determination to complete the task no matter what the cost. And Viper 77 specifically, pressed the colonel. For the first time since the debriefing began, Castellanos' professional composure completely dissolved. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight of emotion that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear her words. Viper 77 saved my life today, not just by continuing to fly when it should have crashed, but by carrying me through something that I don't think I could have survived alone. When I lost consciousness for about 10 minutes during the flight home, yes, I lost consciousness, though I didn't report it over the radio. The aircraft maintained level flight and course heading without any input from me. When I came to, we were exactly where we needed to be, on course for home. The silence in the room was complete, broken only by the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. General Thornfield exchanged glances with Colonel Hayes, both of them recognizing that they were documenting something that existed at the intersection of human experience and mechanical impossibility. "Captain," the general said quietly, "what you're describing goes beyond standard pilot training, beyond normal aircraft performance parameters, beyond what our technical manuals say is possible. I need you to understand that your report will be classified at the highest levels, and the details of this mission will be restricted to only those with a specific need to know. But I also need you to understand that what you accomplish today will change how we approach impossible missions in the future." Castellanos wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the gesture somehow making her appear both more vulnerable and more human than she had throughout the entire debriefing. "Sir, I didn't do this for recognition or to prove anything about what's possible. I did it because soldiers on the ground were counting on me, and because that target needed to be eliminated. Everything else, the impossible flight characteristics, the aircraft's response to damage, my ability to maintain control under circumstances that should have been fatal, all of that was just what happened in service of the mission." She stood up again, moving to the window that looked out over the flight line where emergency crews were still working around the remains of Viper 77. "But sir, I need you to know that I couldn't have done it alone. That aircraft and I, we were partners out there. We took care of each other when everything else was falling apart. And now," she gestured toward the twisted metal visible through the window, "now she's gone, and I'm not sure how to process that." The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing the emotional cost of her impossible achievement. General Thornfield recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented, not just a mission debrief, but a glimpse into the psychological reality of a pilot who had forged a connection with her aircraft that transcended normal human-machine relationships. As the formal debriefing continued for another hour, covering technical details and tactical assessments, a larger story began to emerge. Captain Luna Castellano hadn't simply survived an impossible mission through luck or superior piloting skills. She had accomplished something that existed at the very edge of human potential, pushing herself and her aircraft beyond the boundaries of what military science considered possible. But the cost of that achievement was becoming apparent. In the days that followed, as intelligence analysts confirmed the successful elimination of the high-value target and the disruption of Taliban operations throughout the region, Captain Castellanos struggled with what she privately called survivor's guilt in reverse. Not guilt over surviving when others had died, but guilt over the fact that her aircraft had been destroyed in service of her survival. The psychological evaluation that followed would document a pilot forever changed by her experience in the Kandahar corridor, someone who had touched the absolute limits of human capability and had been marked by the experience in ways that defied simple categorization. But that was still days in the future. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the impossible, there was only the quiet voice of a small, injured pilot explaining how she had redefined what it meant to fly in harm's way. 3 weeks after the Kandahar corridor mission, Captain Luna Castellanos sat in a different kind of room, the office of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the Air Force's chief flight psychologist at Nellis Air Force Base. The walls were decorated with photographs of various aircraft and certificates that spoke to Dr. Martinez's expertise in aviation psychology. But the atmosphere was deliberately informal, designed to put pilots at ease during what were often difficult conversations about stress, trauma, and the psychological costs of military aviation. "How are you sleeping, Luna?" Dr. Martinez asked, using the pilot's first name deliberately to establish a more personal connection. Castellanos shifted in her chair, her flight suit replaced by standard duty uniform that couldn't quite hide the careful way she moved, still favoring her left side where her ribs were healing. "Not great, Doc. When I do sleep, I dream about flying. But not normal flying dreams. I dream about flying aircraft that are falling apart around me, about trying to maintain control when nothing responds the way it should." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes on her tablet. "That's not unusual given what you experienced. Your brain is trying to process an event that falls outside normal human experience. Tell me about your relationship with Viper 77. The question brought an immediate change to Castellanos' expression, a softening around the eyes that spoke to deep emotional attachment. "She was my bird for 18 months. I knew every sound she made, every vibration, every quirk in her control responses. When I first started flying her, the crew chief, Senior Airman Thompson, told me she had a reputation for being temperamental. Previous pilots had complained about control sensitivity, unusual engine characteristics, things like that. But you didn't experience those problems." "Just the opposite. From the first flight, it was like she was trying to communicate with me, to show me what she was capable of if I learned to work with her instead of just commanding her." Castellanos paused, staring out the window at the flight line where other A-10s were visible in the distance. "I know how that sounds, Doc. I know it sounds like I'm anthropomorphizing a machine, attributing human characteristics to something that's just metal and electronics and hydraulics." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging rather than clinical. "Luna, I've been working with combat pilots for 15 years. Some of the most effective aviators I've known have described similar relationships with their aircraft. It's not uncommon, and it's not necessarily unhealthy. What concerns me is how you're processing the loss of that aircraft." For the first time in the session, Castellanos' professional composure cracked completely. Tears she had been holding back for weeks began to flow, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She died saving me, Doc. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what happened. After I lost consciousness during the flight home, something kept that aircraft flying straight and level until I came to. The flight data recorder shows no control inputs during that 10-minute period, but the aircraft maintained perfect course and altitude. The technical investigation team attributed that to gyroscopic stability and trim settings," Dr. Martinez said gently. "The technical investigation team wasn't there." Castellanos' response was quiet but firm. "They didn't feel what I felt in that cockpit. They didn't experience the way she responded to my inputs even when her systems were failing. They didn't watch her hold together through damage that should have caused immediate catastrophic failure." She wiped her eyes with a tissue, struggling to articulate something that existed beyond the realm of technical explanation. "Luna, what you experienced was extraordinary by any measure. You performed at a level that defied mathematical probability, displayed skills that exceeded your training parameters, and accomplished a mission that every expert considered impossible. It's natural that your mind would try to understand that experience by attributing some of your success to external factors, in this case, to a special relationship with your aircraft." Castellanos looked directly at the psychologist, her eyes still wet with tears but blazing with conviction. "Doc, with respect, you're trying to rationalize something that can't be rationalized. I'm not making this up to avoid taking credit for what happened, and I'm not creating false memories to cope with trauma. What I experienced in that cockpit was a partnership, a collaboration between pilot and machine that went beyond anything I was taught in flight school." Dr. Martinez made more notes, her expression thoughtful. In her 15 years of working with combat pilots, she had encountered various forms of psychological adaptation to extreme stress, but there was something different about Captain Castellanos' account. The pilot wasn't displaying symptoms of dissociation or false memory creation. Instead, she seemed to be struggling with the challenge of articulating an experience that fell outside conventional understanding. "Tell me about your call sign," the psychologist said, changing direction. "Wraith, that's not typical for A-10 pilots." The question brought a small, sad smile to Castellanos' face. "I earned that during my second deployment to Afghanistan. I had a habit of appearing in contested airspace without warning, delivering ordnance on target, and disappearing before enemy forces could effectively respond. Other pilots started joking that I was like a ghost, there one moment, gone the next, leaving only destruction in my wake. But it became more than just a joke. It became my identity as a pilot. The Wraith wasn't just Luna Castellanos flying an A-10. The Wraith was something more, a fusion of pilot, aircraft, and mission that created capabilities beyond the sum of its parts." She paused, staring at her hands. "And now the Wraith is gone. Viper 77 is scrap metal, and I'm just Luna Castellanos again, sitting in a psychologist's office trying to explain something that doesn't make sense to anyone who wasn't there." Dr. Martinez recognized that they had reached the core of the psychological challenge facing her patient. Captain Castellanos wasn't struggling with post-traumatic stress in the traditional sense. Instead, she was grappling with the loss of an identity that had been forged through extraordinary circumstances, an identity that had been inextricably linked to a specific aircraft and a specific way of approaching impossible missions. "Luna, I want to ask you a difficult question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe you can continue to be an effective combat pilot without Viper 77? The question hung in the air between them, encompassing not just technical capability, but the fundamental question of whether Captain Luna Castellanos could rebuild her identity as a pilot after losing the aircraft that had been central to her most extraordinary achievements. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as she considered not just the practical aspects of the question, but the deeper psychological implications. "I don't know, Doc. I honestly don't know." That admission would prove to be the beginning of a longer conversation about identity, capability, and the psychological foundations.